What's up guys, Sean here, and today I want to talk about Jack Dorsey's second appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. Before we get started, real quick recap. Last month, Jack Dorsey appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience. It was probably the most hated podcast that Joe Rogan ever did. And the reason it was hated so much is because Joe Rogan barely even mentioned censorship, which was a major issue for the people watching that podcast. A lot of people were outraged by this podcast, but I was not one of them. Would I have preferred Joe Rogan ask more questions about Twitter censorship? Absolutely. But I understand that despite what the media says, Joe Rogan isn't really one of us in that he is not a political commentator. His podcast is a broad-based podcast that sometimes deals with political issues. So while I was hoping for more questions about censorship in that original podcast, I wasn't expecting it, and I think that's why I didn't really have the same reaction that a lot of people on my side had. That being said, because Rogan's a decent dude who actually takes feedback from his audience, he decided to ask Jack Dorsey to come back on the podcast to discuss censorship specifically. He also had Tim Pool on the podcast before to kind of study up on Twitter censorship, and then, in the best move of all time, he brought Tim Pool on with him to go up against Jack Dorsey and Jack Dorsey's head of trust and safety at Twitter. All in all, I do think this podcast, for those who are really upset with Rogan, was very redeeming. I think Tim Pool did an excellent job pressing both Dorsey and the head of trust and safety. And while I do appreciate Dorsey and the head of trust and safety coming on the podcast again to address these issues specifically, after watching the podcast and watching clips of the podcast over and over again, I found their answers really inconsistent and unsatisfactory, and they actually ended up confirming our suspicions about Twitter censorship rather than quieting them down. With all that being said, there was one point in particular that I wish was made on the podcast that wasn't, and it needs to be brought up because the issue is actually a lot worse with Twitter than people actually understand. And conservatives, people on the right, and people who are worried about Twitter's policies and the policies of all these social media companies make this mistake as well. And this is the idea that all these companies, and Twitter in particular, have double standards. That is not the case. We are actually in a much worse situation than if they just had double standards. You see, calling it a double standard makes it seem like what the problem is that when conservatives do A, they get banned, but when liberals do A, they don't get banned. While there are examples of this, that is not the issue. Because in reality, what's actually happening is conservatives are getting banned even when they don't do A. However, liberals, when they do in fact violate the terms of service, they actually do A, they don't get banned. Let me give you a perfect example of what I mean. Recently it was discovered that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gave an email meant for congressional staff to her boyfriend. Now this is actually an ethics violation because Ocasio-Cortez says that her boyfriend is not staff, but the reporter that exposed this and posted a screenshot of that email on Twitter was suspended for holding members of the government accountable under Twitter's doxing policy. Now, I want to make this 100% clear. One of the reasons that members of Congress and official congressional staff have government emails is so that the public can reach out to them. These emails are meant to be public, and that was what was exposed. So you have a reporter in this instance being punished by Twitter for not doxing somebody, for doing their job. Conversely, you had Antifa leak the personal details, including addresses, where their kids went to school, personal telephone numbers of ICE agents. They distributed all of that personal information on Twitter, and as Tim Pool pointed out, at the time of the podcast, they were not banned from Twitter.
You say it's about behavior. You said it several times already. But I've got tons of examples of that not being the case.
And you will always be able to find those examples.
Yeah, examples where you guys were alerted multiple times and did nothing. Like when Antifa doxed a bunch of law enforcement agents, some of the tweets were removed, but since September, this tweet is still live with a list of private phone numbers, addresses.
So on one hand, you have a conservative who is suspended from Twitter for exposing impropriety on the part of a left-wing congresswoman, which is not doxing, but on the other hand, you have a radical left-wing organization exposing private personal details of ICE agents, which is doxing, not getting suspended. That's not a double standard. That's a completely different set of rules for one side than the other. That's Twitter on one hand shielding a left-wing congresswoman from a potential ethics investigation, while protecting criminals as they are committing a crime and calling for more crimes to be committed against those ICE agents. Again, conservatives being punished for not doing A when leftists are allowed to do A. Another glaring and obvious example of Twitter's asymmetric standards came up when Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones bans were being discussed. Now, I want to pause before I get into the story because it's really important to remember that these were expected questions. Jack Dorsey brought the head of trust and safety specifically to answer these questions. Milo was going to come up, Jones was going to come up, so Twitter had all the time to prepare to address Milo and Jones. And the answers that were given were comically awful. Because when you cut through all the nonsense and all the excuses, what actually happened to both of these figures is that they were banned due to outside media pressure, not due to any of the violations that were listed. And the reason that's blatantly obvious is because Twitter had a month to prepare for this podcast. They had a month to come up with a good reason for these bans. And they brought up examples like Milo Yiannopoulos putting that he was a BuzzFeed reporter in his bio on Twitter, which was obviously a joke because Milo Yiannopoulos would not work at BuzzFeed.
So Milo had a number of tweets that violated our rules going back to 2014. But I'm going to talk about the final three in this three strikes concept. He claimed to be a BuzzFeed reporter in his bio. And he's a verified account, so that is impersonation. I'm not sure why he did that. He did do that.
They had a nonsense violation for Jones, saying he posted a video of a child being attacked. Like him or not, respect him or not, but Jones does technically run a news outlet. So he's allowed to report on things that are newsworthy, and no other media outlet would have had the scrutiny that Jones had for posting that video.
There was a video that was uploaded that showed a child being violently thrown to the ground and crying. So that was the first one.
Another completely nonsensical excuse on why Jones was banned was that he confronted Oliver Darcy on video and posted that video on Twitter.
So the third strike that we looked at was a verbal altercation that Alex got into with a journalist. And in that altercation, which was uploaded to Twitter, there were a number of statements using eyes of the rat, even more evil looking person. He is just scum. You're a virus to America and freedom, smelling like a possum that climbed out of the rear end of a dead cow. You look like a possum that got caught doing some really, really nasty stuff, in my view. So there was a bunch of
That's enough? Really? That's hilarious.
Look, would I have used any of the language that Alex did when he confronted Oliver Darcy? Most likely not. In fact, I can basically guarantee you that I wouldn't do that. However, the reason Jones was confronting Darcy is because Darcy was writing articles trying to get Jones banned from social media, and Jones had already been nuked from most of the social media platforms that he was on, in part due to lobbying by people like Darcy, and Darcy in particular. I find it completely asinine that Twitter would punish Jones for calling out the guy that's trying to take away his income. I'm sorry, but is it Twitter's position that somebody can dog you every day? They can go to different social media platforms to try to get you banned. They can go to bank accounts, payment processors, and that's 100% fine and totally acceptable. But the moment that you confront them, point out what they're doing, call them out on what they're doing, then there's a problem. We're not talking about an intern or a low-level employee that's just cashing a paycheck at an activist organization, but is really still a private citizen. We're talking about a public figure that was being confronted for going after another public figure, the one that happened to be confronting him. Now, while those violations were ridiculous, complete nonsense justifications that were done after the fact, after Twitter had already made the decision to ban Jones and Yiannopoulos for political reasons due to media pressure, that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about are the completely ridiculous non-threats that Twitter classified as threats after the fact to justify the ban.
He tweeted to somebody else, if you were my child, I'd have dashed your head on a rock and tried again, which we viewed as a threat.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That seems like he's saying, like, your mom should have swallowed you.
That is not a threat at all, objectively, on any level. That is an insult. It is the equivalent of telling somebody that their dad should have pulled out or their mom should have swallowed. There's just more violent imagery involved in the way that Milo Yiannopoulos said it than those other ways of saying it, but in no way, shape, or form was that a threat. And the same exact thing is true for 2 of the violations listed for Jones.
The second one was a video that we viewed as incitement of violence. I can read it to you. It's a little bit of a transcript, but now it's time to act on the enemy before they do a false flag. I know the Justice Department's crippled a bunch of followers and cowards, but there's groups, there's grand juries, you called for it. It's time politically, economically, and judiciously, and legally, and criminally to move against these people. It's got to be done now. Get together the people you know aren't traitors, aren't cowards, aren't helping their frickin' bets, hedging their frickin' bets like all these other assholes do, and let's go, let's do it. So people need to have and then there's a bunch of other stuff, but at the end, so people need to have their battle rifles ready and everything ready at their bedsides, and you've got to be ready because the media is so disciplined in their deception.
Without a doubt, there's violent imagery, but if you break down any of these statements, they're just not a threat. That's just not true. So Twitter will suspend and ban conservatives for violent rhetoric, for not issuing threats, but they allow the left to threaten children on their platform. Case in point, all of the threats related to the Covington incident.
Yeah. So if someone threatened the lives of someone else, would you ban that account? Would you tell them, like let's say someone tweeted 3 times, kill these people, I want them dead, 3 times. Is that?
Yes, that's a violation.
You didn't ban him, though.
We talked about it in a video that I made at the time, but you had verified people on Twitter calling for violence against these kids. You had somebody say, when you see these kids, fire on them, burn down the school. You had a musician offer a bounty to do violence against them. He promised 18 vinyl albums to anybody who would attack these kids. You had Kathy Griffin call for the doxing of these kids, but the head of trust and safety at Twitter not only thinks that that's not worthy of a ban, but she ended up lying to cover for Kathy Griffin in that interview.
What did you guys do with Kathy Griffin when she was saying she wanted the names of those young kids wearing the MAGA hats at the Covington High School kids?
Yeah, that's a great example, Joe. So in that particular case, our doxing policy really focuses on posting private information, which we don't consider names to be private. We consider your home address, your home phone number, your mobile phone number, those types of things to be private.
She said Kathy Griffin technically didn't call for doxing because she called for the names, and Twitter doesn't consider names doxing. Now, unfortunately for anybody peddling that nonsense, Kathy Griffin followed up her original tweet with another tweet that said something to the effect of, if you think these kids wouldn't dox you in a heartbeat, you're dead wrong. She may have just called for the names of children to be out there in her first tweet, but she indisputably called for doxing in a follow-up. So conservatives can get banned for not threatening somebody, but people on the left can threaten children, and not only will Twitter not ban them, they'll send the head of trust and safety on the Rogan podcast to cover for them. Now, you can use the Covington example to expose a bunch of asymmetric standards for the left and the right on Twitter. For example, without a shadow of a doubt, what was going on against the kids of Covington was a harassment campaign instigated on Twitter. A lot of the stuff that was being targeted against these kids was actually criminal in and of itself, but Twitter, of course, did not ban these people. However, they did suspend the editor-in-chief of the Daily Caller for tweeting "learn to code" while quote tweeting a Daily Show clip, under the justification that tweeting "learn to code" wasn't participating in a joke on Twitter, it was engaging in a harassment campaign. So again, conservatives punished for not doing A, while liberals are allowed to do A with impunity. Another fantastic moment that I don't want to end this video without mentioning was when the head of trust and safety started explaining why Sargon of Akkad was banned on Twitter. One of his violations was pointing out all the hashtags that left-wingers use that don't get you banned from Twitter. That tweet was reported, and Sargon, that became a strike against you when you were banned from Twitter. So according to Twitter, you can use hashtags like #KillAllMen with impunity as long as you're earnest about it. But the moment that you point out that Twitter allows people on the left to use hashtags like that with impunity, despite the fact that they're earnest about it, that's a violation on you. This podcast was amazing and illuminating in so many ways because they just don't have a good explanation for their asymmetric standards. Because in reality, they're not enforcing any standards, they're enforcing an ideology on their platform. And every time it was pointed out, clear as day for the world to see, every time they were backed into a corner, they had 2 answers and they were both equally weak.
So this is a trial and error, sort of learn and move on with new information sort of a deal.
Absolutely. We're going to learn. We're going to make a ton of mistakes. We're trying to do this with hundreds of millions of accounts all around the world, numerous languages. We're going to make mistakes. Even if we get better, there will always be mistakes. But we're hoping to learn from those and to make ourselves better and to catch cases like Tim's or others where we clearly may have made an error. And I'm open to having those discussions. I'm sorry, Tim, familiar with your specific cases, but I'd love to follow up with you and really try to understand.
The first is that it was just a mistake, and Twitter's going to make a lot more mistakes going forward. So, if you see some sketchy things that clearly look like an ideological bias guiding Twitter's judgment on who they ban, who they suspend, who they don't ban, who they don't suspend, don't worry about that, because it's probably just a mistake, and they're going to make mistakes going forward. So don't worry about it. Mistake, accident. Do you believe them? And the next one was delivered all the time by Dorsey when he was backed into a corner, that what Twitter's trying to mitigate, what they're worried about, is real world impact and situations like doxing, which is very sneaky language, because what he was not talking about and what he was responding to every time he said this was situations like doxing, stuff that could have real world impact, which is incredibly vague.
This is also an evolution in prioritization as well. One of the things we've come to recently is we do need to prioritize these efforts, both in terms of policy, enforcement, how we're thinking about evolving them. One of the things that we want to focus on as number one is physical safety. And this leads you immediately to something like doxing. And right now, the only way we take action on a doxing case is if it's reported or not.
The real world impact that he's actually talking about and he's actually trying to prevent is people using his platform, beating the mainstream media on all these platforms, and having the real world impact of making elections like Brexit and the 2016 presidential election go in a way that the mainstream did not want to go. That's what this is all about. It's clearly obvious. It's what it's always been about. Everything was perfectly fine when Obama was gaming platforms like Facebook and beating the Republicans on Twitter. But as soon as conservatives took the advantage, as soon as they started destroying narratives like Brexit, that's when social media started getting mainstream scrutiny. I said it in my last video, and I'll say it again. They can't win fairly on these platforms. So they're trying to control the distribution of information so that they can control the outcome of elections. Anyway, that's all I really have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I definitely recommend you check out the full podcast for full context. If you like this video, then please show me by leaving a like. Please share this video so that other people can see it. Also, follow me on my social medias. I am on Twitter. I am on Gab. Links are in the description. If you would like to support me, you can do so via one-time donation on PayPal or through Patreon or Subscribestar. This has been me breaking down the Joe Rogan, Tim Pool, Jack Dorsey, and that lady that I don't remember her name podcast. Till next time.